Artists like Daft Punk and Justice do such a good job at meshing together acoustic and electronic drum kits seamlessly. And it's not just dance music that uses this technique. Pop, rock, and even metal music often layers sampled drums with acoustic drums to get a more punchy, in-your-face sound. And this is actually a very old technique that might date back further than you would think. I have heard that producer Roger Nichols is credited with pioneering this with Steely Dan back in the 70s. Go a decade later, and this is all over Michael Jackson's hit album Thriller. You can find some YouTube videos, actually, of producer Anthony Marinelli talking about this, and you can see him playing with mixing Linn drum samples with acoustic drums to get some of the famous catchy grooves from Thriller. And it's no surprise that artists like Daft Punk and Justice, who were so inspired by a lot of earlier dance music, used this technique as part of their signature sound and really pushed it further to change dance music forever. Let's first take a listen to the demo track we're going to be working with today. Next, let's take a listen to the acoustic drum kit. Next, let's take a listen to the synthetic drum kit. And each sound in this synthetic kit is designed from scratch with that acoustic drum specifically in mind. So that's the workflow we're going to be going through, is using that acoustic kit as a reference to design synthetic drums that blend nicely with it. And it's tedious, but at the end of the day, you're going to be left with a really nice kit that you can reuse on a bunch of tracks. Cool. So I think these drums sound great. Personally, I couldn't be happier with them for this track. And now let's talk about the workflow of creating them. So step one is to choose your acoustic kit. And the emphasis of this step is on choosing a drum kit holistically rather than finding individual drums that all sound good on their own but don't work together. So in this case, I've chosen the Vintage Dry Kit, which is a collection of Ludwig pieces with Zildjian and Sabian cymbals, and it sounds really nice. It was sampled by Addictive Drums. Everything's very damp and tight. And you could also go like the Daft Punk route and lift samples from drum breaks or even record your own drums. But what's important about this step is choosing a kit that works together cohesively. And making this decision up front about which acoustic kit I would be modeling is actually a kind of new or recent development in my sound design process. It used to be that my first step, or like my entry point to drum sound design, would be like the goal of those sessions would be to create as many different types of snares as I could, or as many different kicks as I could, dropping them in a folder, and then later when I'm making a track, kind of dragging those samples in and finding out what works at that moment. And there's nothing wrong with that previous approach of creating a bunch of kicks and snares in isolation and putting them together later. You can definitely still create a cohesive drum kit that way. But I think I have been getting better results with this new workflow, and I think there's a pretty good reason why this workflow has been serving me well recently. And it's that while I used to think of the snare as its own instrument and the tom as its own instrument, I think my mindset has been shifting towards thinking of the drum kit as an instrument, where all of these pieces work together and they need to be tuned musically to pleasing intervals. And it's not even just the tuning, it's also like the way you set them up. Like there's kind of a vision that some producer had behind this drum kit. It's that they wanted a vintage dry sound. And like every piece of this drum kit hits that, it gives that vibe of dry vintage. Like they specifically tuned in the damping, the materials used, like everything works together. And I think now that I've been trying to create that in my drum sound design sessions, I've been getting much better results. And step 2 of our process is going to be to isolate each drum in our acoustic kit and then model it with our synthesizer. So we're going to have to repeat this process for each drum, but we're going to start with the snare. Cool, so let's first take a look at how we build this synthetic snare from scratch so that it layers nicely with this acoustic snare. Okay, so go ahead and initialize the preset and then choose analog basic shapes for your oscillator A. And we'll keep the sine wave, but we'll want to turn the phase random down, and I'm going to set the phase to 0 degrees, just something I personally like to do. And then we can see that's currently playing some sine wave, but we want to match the fundamental frequency of our acoustic drum. So I use this spectrum analyzer up here in the top right. Makes it easy to find which note it's playing. In this case, it looks like it's around a D sharp 3. So then if I go over to my drum rack, which is triggering my Serum patch, I can open up this menu and then click I/O, and now you can see this snare patch, even though the incoming note is D1, which is just kind of set up that way because of I want this patch to also trigger the sampler, the Addictive Drums sampler. So I want this D1 to come in to map to a snare, but I don't want the snare to play a D1. I want it to play a D sharp 2. So that's what I've set up here. And kind of annoyingly, you can't type it in. You kind of have to drag it around until it's right. But this is set up nicely where now if I play it, it shows up as a D sharp 3 over here. All right, the next thing I want to do is find out what overtones are playing in this acoustic drum. So I'm going to make this a little bit bigger, well, a lot bigger. And I can see that there's the first overtone is actually 7 semitones above. It's at an A sharp 3. So if I go back over to Serum, I can dial in oscillator B to take the role of this. And so let's choose basic shapes, and again, rand 0, phase start at 0 degrees, but then we're going to tune this up 7 semitones. But that's too much energy. You can see in the acoustic drum, the first overtone has significantly less energy. So let's actually tune in our amplitude envelopes next before we choose the gain. So I'm going to turn the level down. Then I'm going to choose LFO1 to go to the first oscillator A. And then I'm going to choose envelope mode and a free running oscillator. And that's about the right amount of time. Then we can choose LFO2 to go to our first overtone. So yeah, I also got to choose BPM, turn that off, envelope mode. And now I'm looking at the spectrogram. I want this first overtone to be, it should die off quicker. You can see like the fundamental has the longest tail with this acoustic drum. So yeah, that's looking good. And then let me see if there's any other higher order harmonics we want to add. Probably need to make this bigger. It looks like more or less there is another A sharp 4, so like 1 octave above this. So we could go into our harmonic editor for this basic shapes, for the sine wave, and we could put in a, if we put in the second harmonic here, this should give us an A sharp 4. So let's see what that sounds like. So next things next, let's add in our noise source. And just from experimenting before, I think I liked the bright white quite a bit. And I'm going to bring the level down again and then choose LFO3 to control the level. And the shape that sometimes works for snares is to kind of let this noise come in at the beginning to accentuate the attack. And then we're going to have it kind of come in like this. And that's way too loud. And then I'm going to put this through a high pass filter. So I'll turn the filter on, disable oscillator A, enable noise source, and then choose normal high 12, and then put that somewhere around like 1 kilohertz. And I got to remember to turn the BPM off the envelope or the LFO and turn it into envelope mode. You could even make it kind of more like a clap by putting in a couple hits at the beginning, like a couple of transient pulses. So it's probably pretty subtle, the difference. But now there's kind of like a clap at the beginning. Then I want to drive this into a distortion. So I'm going to choose soft clip and turn the drive all the way up. And then this is a pretty damp drum that we're modeling. So let's put on a filter, MG Low 6. And then one other little detail is you can see in the spectrogram, there's a little dip in the pitch, whereas ours currently has this solid pitch. So something we might want to do there, we might want to add another LFO in envelope mode to the pitch. So I'm going to map this to the master tune. Let's choose LFO4 and map that to the master tuning in unipolar mode. And it's pretty subtle for a snare. It's not like a kick drum. So this little highlight on the spectrogram is what I'm looking at. And now that's looking more similar. So layered, the drum is sounding pretty weak, but that's the nice thing about drum synthesis is it's really easy to fix any of those problems. So if it's sounding weak or flimsy, you just need more fundamental. So I'm going to go into this oscillator A and just turn up the envelope amount. And maybe turn down the noise. And then let's go into our envelope 2 and maybe turn that up as well. Okay, it's sounding better. I'm still not completely happy with it. So let me do a couple extra things. Let's add an EQ and boost the top. And now that I'm hearing the top brighter, I'm kind of realizing this envelope is what I don't like. There you go. So it needed a little snappier noise envelope. Cool. So there's our layered snare. Let's hear just the electronic version again. And now mixed with the acoustic drum, it's sounding pretty good. And actually, on listening to these a little bit, I think it's a little out of tune. Like, let's listen to this acoustic drum. I'm kind of hearing da 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 da. Like I'm hearing the synthetic drum a little sharp, which also could have been a reason to sounding a little weak. So I think we need to tune this down a couple semitones. All right, now let's hear our new synthetic snare mixed in with the full kit. Cool, so I think it works still. It's definitely very different than the first synthetic snare I made, but that's the neat thing. Every time you do this, they're always going to end up with something slightly different. Next up, let's make the kick drum. So we have this sound, and it was originally modeled after this sound. And then our 808 style fundamental is on its own, sounds like this. So I have a whole video on how to create the TR-808 style kick drum. I even dive into the circuit schematics, run some circuit simulations, and then do my best to model in faceplant. So that's a whole video. It's kind of long. We shouldn't do that from scratch here. We're just going to use this patch I built, and I'll link the video you should watch if you want to see how to build this from scratch. Anyway, we just really need to worry about these controls up here since this patch is all kind of already set up to sound like an 808. So what I would be doing is, let's say these knobs were in their default position. I would look at this acoustic drum, and I'd notice first off it's much shorter, so let's shorten this decay. And then the fundamental is quite a bit lower, so it's even lower than that, so I'm just going to keep going. So that's looking right, and then you can dial in this tone to taste. So that's already sounding pretty good to me, and it doesn't really have like that room noise of the kick drum, but that's okay since I'm trying to create like a hybrid kit. We'll just borrow the room noise of this acoustic kit. So if I bring up, this is again my second version of acoustic drums. This first version is like my reference, and then the second version is where I'll make some edits of it to gel with the electronic kit. So over here, I've increased the attack of the kick drum to around like 20 milliseconds because I want the transient of the 808. The 808 has a really clicky transient. I'll actually show that, a demo of that in just a second. And then I turn down the fundamental of the acoustic kit so that we hear much more of the 808 like fundamental. It's really solid and punchy, but it's kind of nice how this acoustic kit does have some weight, kind of in like, it's not like on like one specific pitch. It's just kind of like, it's like kind of boomy. So when you layer that together, you get that punchy 808 fundamental, but you still get some of that boominess of the acoustic kit. And yeah, the other thing I want to mention is I do prefer the 808 transient. It cuts through the mix better. So let me show you what that looks like, because it's different than if you used, say, Kick 2 to like emulate an 808. Let's put this in resampling mode. So you can see right here, this beginning of the sine wave, it's not like if you were modeling a transient in, say, something like Kick 2 or Serum, where you would like make the pitch really sharp, or you have a pinch envelope that goes up like many, many octaves. That's one way to get a clicky transient. But the way that 808 works is it's actually, you have this, it's called a trigger pulse, which goes in and it plays the filter like an oscillator. It's called modal synthesis. And this trigger gets filtered by this and it causes it to resonate, but it doesn't completely get filtered. So that's what you're seeing at the beginning of this 808 kick drum. You're seeing that pulse wave just a little bit filtered, and then that pulse causes the filters to ring out like this. But yeah, like you can see it's not like a really high-pitched sine wave sweeping down. It's actually like a pulse from a square wave, and since it's really fast and short, it's like a click, and it really cuts through the mix nice. All right, and now let's try this electronic kick drum mixed back in with the full like hybrid electronic acoustic kit, and then we can fine tune it from here. Nice, that's sounding good to me. All right, next up, let's make the toms. So the hybrid kit sounds like this, with the electronic and the acoustic version mixed together. And then the purely acoustic model I was working with sounds like this. And then the TR-808 style tom patch on its own sounds like this. And I have a whole video, again, on how to make a TR-808 style low tom where I go through the circuits and stuff, but we don't have time to go through all that today. So instead, let's just like talk about what's going on in this patch really quick. So first off, it's like based off a TR-808 tom, but if it were more accurate to the original 808, we'd actually have to turn off the second trigger pulse because they only had one trigger pulse and one set of filters. And it would sound like this, where you just had the fundamental without overtones. That's how the 808 tom worked. Now, what I did to better match this acoustic drum is I needed to model an overtone, because look at this spectrogram. Look at this bright pulse right here. This is an overtone, and it's brighter than the fundamental. And this kind of goes back to my point of why it's really important to find like a good acoustic reference, like a whole kit that works together, is drummers and producers spend time tuning the overtones. Like that's how complicated drum tuning is. You don't just tune the fundamental to whatever pitch is in key of your song and leave it there. You actually have to tune the overtones. It's really interesting. Like if you're, let's say that this one is tuned to like 63 hertz, this particular tom, you could change where this overtone is as well as the loudness by essentially changing the difference of tightness between the top head and the bottom head of the drum. You can keep it tuned at 63 hertz, but move the overtone around. So there's a lot of difference there. And then playing with essentially like how damp you keep the sides versus the center, you can make the overtones louder or quieter. Like there's a lot of work that goes into this, and the overtones should be musical as well, if your drum kit's set up well. So this is why it's good to have a good acoustic reference. And I can see here this overtone was very prominent, and I wasn't going to go through it and model each overtone individually. Instead, what I was going to do was I just wanted to model that one really bright overtone with the fundamental. So over here, I added the second trigger pulse, which is now stimulating these filter banks. And you can see these are separate. They don't feed in, lane 1 doesn't feed into lane 2. They both go to lane 3. So these are separate parallel paths, and these triggers excite each of these filters separately. And one of these is tuned at the fundamental by playing with this knob, and then the other one, I just kind of looked at the frequency and dialed this filter in to resonate at that overtone. So again, like without it, it sounds like this. And then when we add that overtone in, it sounds like that. So that sounded pretty good. Let's hear the second tom, I guess I called it the mid tom. So once again, we had two really prominent resonances in the acoustic kit. And I modeled those over here with essentially the exact same patch, just tuning the resonances slightly differently. And then basically we just layer in the acoustics again, but we're going to cut out the fundamental. We're going to have the punchier 808 fundamental and the clickier attack by increasing the attack, or the volume envelope on the acoustic kit. So altogether it sounds like this. And then together with the full drum kit, sounds like this. All right, so we've got this closed hi-hat here, and you can check out my previous TR-808 hi-hat video if you want to see how to make this from scratch. But basically what's going on is we've got a bunch of detuned oscillators, and these all create this kind of like swarmy atonal mess of noise, especially when you filter out the fundamental frequency. The top frequencies are just kind of left with this, it almost sounds like white noise, but it's a little bit more tonal than white noise. And you can see in the spectrum, there's some kind of like hot spots. There's some places where this sound resonates. So making this 808 hat gel with the acoustic hat isn't so much like the toms where I try and like get specific frequencies to pop out. In fact, quite the opposite. I think that I want the synthetic hi-hat to kind of complement the acoustic hi-hat and kind of poke out of a different part of the frequency spectrum. So what I'll do is I'll kind of play these together. And I have different variations of the 808 hat where I replace these oscillators with, other waveforms. That one's really loud. Let me turn that down. And I think this one with the square waves is actually the most faithful to the original 808. And it sounds pretty cool. In fact, I guess for this demo where we're kind of like recreating this sound, we can keep it there. Let me do one thing is I want to change the decay of the sound because this is supposed to be our closed hi-hat. So let me dial this in. All right. And then we can look at the open hi-hat, which is actually, it's the same process. It's just going to be changing the decay times. So yeah, for the open one, I really like this FM sound. And then we can take a look at the crash, which is I made in Serum. And this one, if you actually look up an AU5 video on making cymbals, I was inspired by his technique there to make this patch. So what's going on here is we'll have, once Serum finishes rescaling, we have a bunch of sine waves with a lot of unison, and they're detuned, and you go to the global settings and you tune your unison range all the way to 48 semitones. So you get this, once again, just like the 808, you get a whole swarm of oscillators that are detuned from each other. But then what you do is you have oscillator B with a whole other swarm of detuned oscillators, and you FM from B to A. Oscillator A has FM from B, and that's how you get this, another way of getting a swarm of dissonant oscillators, and that sounds like this. Yeah, so once again, it's this like bright metallic sound. It's definitely digital, but when paired with this acoustic crash, it's a nice like bright sound. And then let's hear what all these cymbals sound like with our full kit again. And one other thing I want to say about the cymbals is that it's a totally valid approach to just use the acoustic cymbals with like the rest of your electronic acoustic kit. Like I think that can still get a really modern dance music type of sound. In fact, like the 909, the TR-909 drum machine, those cymbals are sampled. Like they aren't electronic cymbals. They're just, the 909 is a hybrid where there's analog kick drums and I think snares and so on. But the hi-hats are, in the open hat in particular, that's a sampler. So you can sometimes get away with not adding in these digital drums or electronic drums. So let me mute these and show you what it sounds like. So it is a little dull only because I have programmed these hi-hats or I guess dialed in these hats to take up a little less space in the mix. But yeah, that could be one route you go where you don't even have the electronic drums, but let's turn these back down and bring back in the the digital drums. So again, another nice bright sound, but both are valid. Let me do before and after one more time without so much talking between. Cool. So those are all the drum sounds I'm going to make today. I hope this was useful for you. If you did find it useful, it's really helpful if you can give this video a like and a subscribe if you haven't already. We did just hit 1,000 subscribers last week, so thanks to all of you for continuing to watch and subscribe. It's super helpful, and I'm happy about that. So yeah, thanks again, and I will see you next time.